23:18 hours. July 17, 1944. On the quiet shoreline of Northern California, the night was still, flat, heavy, almost indifferent. Then, without warning, the horizon lit up like a magnesium flare. A sphere of white fire rose above the naval pier, bright enough to carve shadows across the hills almost 10 kilometers away. For a fraction of a second, it looked unreal, like a silent sun blooming over the Sacramento River Delta. And then the sound arrived. A pressure wave roared across the bay, slamming against walls, shattering windows, throwing men from their bunks as if the earth itself had snapped. At the epicenter, Port Chicago, 2 ammunition-laden ships simply ceased to exist. Steel, concrete, wood, bodies, and air fused into a single expanding cloud. Nothing survived within a radius that should have been safe. Nothing was left to identify. In just 2 seconds, 320 men were gone. But this story does not begin with the explosion. It begins with the system that made it possible. Port Chicago was never meant to be a symbol. It was just another link in the vast American supply chain feeding the war across the Pacific. A place where naval ordnance, bombs, depth charges, shells, powder, was loaded with speed, efficiency, and relentless repetition. By mid-1944, the United States was moving mountains of explosives every day, pushing its logistics beyond anything previously imagined. Victory depended on rhythm, on tempo, on ships leaving full and leaving fast. And Port Chicago had a rhythm that felt more like pressure. Young sailors, most of them barely trained, most of them with no experience in handling explosives, worked under officers who believed that speed was a measure of morale. Men were told to load faster, always faster, because the war demanded it. Complaints about safety were dismissed. The idea of standardized procedures existed on paper, but on the pier, expectation replaced instruction. Explosive crates were dropped, mishandled, stacked under tension. Engines vibrated too close. Lights flickered. Forklifts rattled. Even the officers admitted later that they didn't really know how much risk the men faced. Still, every night, the loading continued. And on July 17th, 2 ships stood side by side at the pier, the SS E.A. Bryan and the SS Quinault Victory. Between them, more than 4,600 tons of explosives. Bombs for B-24s. Depth charges for destroyers. Naval shells large enough to split hulls. All of it being moved by men who were told the same thing every shift. Keep the pace up. The fleet needs the cargo. What no one said aloud, but everyone felt, was something simpler, heavier, and far more dangerous. We don't really know how safe this is. The truth is, the system worked until it didn't. And when it failed completely. When investigators looked back at Port Chicago, one detail stood out immediately. Almost no one on the pier truly understood what they were handling. Ammunition came in dozens of shapes, sizes, and stability levels. Some bombs tolerated rough movement, others were sensitive to shock. Certain shells could be stacked, others needed to be isolated. Explosive filler varied between Amatol, TNT, Torpex, and more volatile mixtures that behaved differently under pressure or heat. But the men loading them? Most couldn't tell one type from another. They had been given speed, not knowledge. The U.S. Navy's training pipeline in 1944 was overloaded. New sailors arrived faster than instructors could teach them. Port Chicago, never designed for high-volume ammunition work, became a pressure valve for the entire West Coast. Young recruits were told they would learn by doing, a phrase that sounded harmless until you realized what doing meant. Lifting live explosives onto ships for hours every night, guided by officers who themselves lacked formal training. One witness would later say, "We handled bombs the way we handled potatoes." On paper, this shouldn't have happened. There were manuals, protocols, safety rules. But the gap between paper and practice was wide enough to swallow the pier whole. And the environment itself didn't help. The pier was narrow. The humidity from the delta made wood swell and iron rails vibrate. Engines from cranes rattled constantly, sending tremors into stacks of shells that were never meant to shake. Nearby locomotives shunted boxcars loaded with black powder, each movement producing a metal-on-metal ringing that felt wrong, even to untrained ears. The soundscape of Port Chicago was a chorus of small risks, each harmless alone, but together forming something that felt unstable, unpredictable, waiting. The officers pushed for record loading times. Not out of cruelty, but out of expectation. The Pacific War needed supplies, and the Navy moved to that rhythm. When the E.A. Bryan arrived, it had to be filled, fast. When the Quinault Victory docked beside it, the pace only increased. 2 ships meant double the urgency. It also meant more men on the same narrow space, more movement, more vibration, more strain on every part of the process. Some sailors noticed things that made them uneasy. A bomb crate dropped and bounced. A stack shifted harder than it should have. A fuse assembly looked not quite right. Someone joked nervously about hoping the whole thing doesn't blow. They laughed, but no one felt safe enough to stop. The greatest danger at Port Chicago wasn't the explosives themselves. It was momentum. Once the system started moving, no individual felt they could slow it down. And so the loading continued through the night of July 17th. Crates thudded onto wooden pallets. Chains clinked. Engines hummed. Forklifts rattled over uneven planks. Every vibration traveled somewhere. Into the hulls of the ships, into the stacks of bombs, into the hands of men who assumed the Navy wouldn't put them in danger. After all, they were sailors in wartime. They had orders. The system must know what it's doing. But the system didn't. And in the next block, we enter the final minutes before the blast, when small, almost invisible details aligned into catastrophe. By 10 p.m., Port Chicago looked almost routine. The night air carried the usual mix of salt, oil, and wood dust drifting from the piers. Floodlights washed the entire scene in a pale glow, flattening shadows and making everything appear strangely calm, even organized. To an outsider, it might have looked like nothing more than another shift on America's West Coast war pipeline. But anyone standing on that pier long enough could sense it, the subtle tension humming under the surface. Men moved quickly, too quickly, lifting crates that weighed more than they should for their size. Forklifts jerked forward and back, their metal forks scraping just a little too close to the wooden boxes stamped with stenciled warnings. The E.A. Bryan, already heavily loaded, creaked under the weight of almost 3,000 tons of explosives. Every sound it made echoed through the planks. And the Quinault Victory, new, fast, and only partially loaded, sat just a few meters away, sharing the same narrow platform, the same vibrations, the same air. One sailor later recalled the moment when a crate slipped from a sling, swung hard, and slammed against the rail before settling. Everyone instinctively froze. No one breathed. Seconds passed. Nothing happened. The work continued. Moments like that happened more than once. But the system had momentum. Stopping felt impossible. At 10:45 p.m., a train on the adjacent track pulled several boxcars into position. Inside were depth charges, some with Torpex fillers, more sensitive than TNT and capable of producing shockwaves underwater strong enough to split a submarine. Moving them required caution. Instead, the cars jolted as the locomotive braked sharply, its wheels screeching. A dull thud vibrated through the pier. Again, no one stopped. Supervising officers, inexperienced with explosives, ordered the men to keep pushing the pace. They wanted numbers, tons loaded per hour. The night crews had even begun competing informally to hit record speeds, rewarded with praise and the approval of commanding officers who didn't fully understand the risk they were creating. A dangerous equation was forming in plain sight. Inexperience plus pressure plus explosives plus vibration plus speed. Some sailors cast uneasy looks toward the Bryan. Its hull sat low in the water. Too low. At least one report mentioned someone commenting that the ship looked heavy enough to burst. The comment was ignored. As the minutes ticked toward 11 p.m., the sounds of the pier blended into a single restless rhythm. Engines humming, chains clinking, wood thudding under crates, the creaking of a ship strained near its limits. It wasn't chaos, exactly. It was something harder to see, Overload. At 11:16 p.m., a witness aboard a nearby ship saw something unusual, a sudden, sharp flash of white light at the Brian's loading hatch. Not an explosion. More like the flare from a welding arc, too bright, too quick, too clean. He blinked, and it was gone. He made a note of the time. Hours later, that small detail would haunt him. By 11:17, another man heard a heavy, metallic crash, something large shifting inside a hold where it shouldn't have moved at all. He paused, listening. Then the normal sounds resumed, and he convinced himself it was nothing. Everything felt almost normal. But the fuse, whatever it was, had already been lit. 11:18 p.m. For a moment, the pier felt almost quiet. The usual clatter of machinery faded as crews shifted positions, preparing the next sequence of loading. A few men stretched their backs. Others checked slings or wiped sweat from their palms. The E.A. Brian sat motionless, its hull pressing low against the water, heavy with more than 3 million pounds of ordnance. Then it happened. A flash, white, clean, blinding, burst from the Brian's forward hold. It wasn't fire. It wasn't orange or red or shaped like a flame. It was closer to a camera flash, but magnified to an impossible scale. A sphere of pure light, silent for the first fraction of a second, expanding outward with terrifying speed. No one on the pier had time to turn, or run, or even finish a thought. The first explosion tore through the Brian with such force that the ship disintegrated. Not shattered, disintegrated. Steel plates bent outward like paper. The deck erupted upward in a sheet of incandescent fragments. A shockwave rolled across the water, lifting it like a wall and flattening it again. Witnesses miles away saw the flash before they heard anything. A physician in Vallejo reported the blast lit up his entire house as if someone had turned on a stadium light outside his window. A few seconds later, the concussion hit, shattering glass, rattling doors, shaking foundations. At Port Chicago, the pier simply stopped existing. The Quinault Victory, though only partially loaded, was torn apart by the same blast. Its stern lifted violently, its superstructure collapsing under the pressure. Men aboard nearby ships were flung through the air. Some woke up underwater, disoriented and bleeding. Others didn't wake up at all. The shockwave spread through the delta like a ripple of force. A 900-pound piece of steel was later found more than a kilometer from the pier. Another fragment, weighing several tons, landed in a field so deeply embedded that it took days to remove. One officer aboard a ship more distant from the pier described what he saw as a white hemisphere rising, then collapsing inward, followed by a roar so deep it felt like the air was being pulled out of your lungs. And then came the second explosion. If the first blast destroyed the Brian, the second, the detonation of munitions thrown into instability, finished everything else. A rolling, violent thunder ripped across the bay, shaking the ground for miles. Trees bent. Birds took flight. Dust rose from the valley floor. In less than 2 seconds, 320 men were gone. The pier where they lived and worked vaporized. The ships they were loading became clouds of twisted iron. The night sky glowed for nearly half a minute. And when the light finally faded, all that remained was the shape of a crater where a structure had stood just moments before. Silence followed, a silence that felt hostile, almost unreal. It was the kind of silence that only comes after something enormous has ended. The survivors, scattered across ships and shore, had no words. Some stumbled through debris. Others tried to move toward the blast site, only to realize there was no site left, just broken pilings and burning fragments floating on the water. What caused the explosion? In that moment, nobody knew. In truth, the investigation would struggle with the same question. But for now, this is the moment when Port Chicago died. For a few seconds after the second blast, no one moved. The shock had frozen everything. The night air hung still, thick with dust and the metallic taste of burning steel. Then the sound began to fade, and what replaced it was worse. Screams, splashing, and the crackle of small fires drifting on the water. Where the pier had stood, there was now only an open wound, an empty void edged by broken pilings still smoldering. Waves rolled through the space where 2 cargo ships had been, carrying fragments of wood, metal, and uniforms. The surface of the bay shimmered under the glow of distant fires, littered with burning debris. Some survivors were thrown into the water before they even understood what had happened. One sailor, later interviewed, said he woke up floating on his back, staring at the stars, unable to hear anything but a high-pitched ringing. He thought he had gone deaf. Another man surfaced gripping a piece of rope as if it were a lifeline, his skin burned, his arms numb. He had no memory of being blown off his ship. On vessels anchored farther out, men stumbled across their decks, dazed, stepping over shattered glass and twisted metal. Officers shouted orders, but their words felt hollow. Nothing could prepare them for what they saw when they ran to the rails and looked toward the pier. There was simply nothing. No ships. No structure. No clear figure of human life. The initial attempts to help were frantic but directionless. Searchlights swung wildly across the water, illuminating pieces of hull, torn gear, and drifting life jackets with no one inside. Boats were lowered into the bay, though wreckage made it difficult to navigate. Some sailors tried to reach the blast zone by swimming, driven by instinct more than hope. The air smelled of explosives, sharp, chemical, unnatural. You could taste it on your tongue. Communication systems were down or overloaded. Radios crackled with fragments of orders. Some installations nearby reported the shockwave as seismic activity. Others assumed an ammunition ship had been struck by enemy sabotage. The idea of a spontaneous accident on such a scale seemed impossible, even to trained officers. Within minutes, word spread to surrounding towns. Windows shattered in Martinez, Vallejo, and Benicia. Residents woke thinking an earthquake had hit. Some saw the glow from the explosion reflected off the low clouds and mistook it for a firestorm. At the naval barracks, panic set in. Dozens of men, those not assigned to the pier, ran outside barefoot, still half asleep, staring at a column of dust rising into the night sky. They knew immediately who had been at the pier. They knew the night shift. They knew their friends. A few tried to sprint toward the docks, but military police held them back until the area could be secured. The officers understood instinctively that there was nothing left to run toward. Ambulances began arriving, though there were few survivors to treat. Medics wandered through debris fields searching for signs of life. The realization settled slowly, heavily. The casualty number would not be dozens. It would be in the hundreds. The scene was overwhelming. Even seasoned rescue personnel later admitted they had never witnessed destruction so total. The glow from burning fragments spread across the bay in small patches, like islands of fire. The water reflected them, turning the surface into a distorted mosaic of orange and black. A faint haze drifted across the harbor, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of detonated ordnance. Survivors began coughing, their throats raw, their eyes burning. And still, no one knew what, exactly, had ignited the disaster. By midnight, the first layers of command had reached the disaster zone. Jeeps rolled through clouds of dust. Officers stepped out into a landscape that didn't resemble a naval facility. It looked more like the aftermath of a weapons test. Even seasoned personnel paused in disbelief. Some stared silently at the empty space where the pier should have been, as if their minds were struggling to redraw the map. The first priority was establishing order. Not rescue, order. Search and rescue teams were already combing the water, but the senior officers quickly understood the scale. The immediate survivors had already been found. What remained were body fragments, twisted steel, and the disturbing quiet of a site where everything had happened too fast for anyone to escape. Commanders ordered the entire base sealed. Military police were stationed at the entrances. Civilians in nearby towns saw trucks racing in but none going out. The Navy wanted control of information, control of movement, and control of narrative, before rumors spread, before panic grew, before anyone outside understood what had truly happened. Medical teams set up triage areas, though they remained mostly empty. A few men lay on stretchers, burned or battered by the blast, their faces still carrying the shock of survival. One medic later wrote that the hardest part wasn't treating wounds, it was realizing how few there were to treat. On the water, Small boats continued to search. They collected debris, and the remains of men whose names would later fill long lists. The surface glowed faintly under searchlights, reflecting pieces of shattered wood and scorched canvas. The recovery crews worked in silence. No one felt the need to speak. At 0:45, the first high-ranking investigators arrived. Ordnance officers, explosives experts, and senior commanders from Mare Island and San Francisco. They walked the shoreline slowly, studying the angles of twisted metal scattered everywhere. Some of the fragments were curled outward, others inward, a detail that mattered. It hinted at sequential detonations instead of a single uniform blast. But even the experts knew one thing instantly. This wasn't sabotage. It didn't match enemy action. It matched something far more uncomfortable: procedural failure. Still, no one said it out loud. The official line, almost immediate, was that the cause was unknown. It was technically true, but strategically convenient. The United States was in the middle of the largest naval campaign in history. An internal collapse of this magnitude raised questions the Navy wasn't ready to answer. So the wording became precise, careful, almost rehearsed. Cause undetermined. Investigation ongoing. No evidence of enemy involvement. Behind the scenes, though, officers exchanged uneasy glances. The amount of explosive ordnance stored on the pier had been massive. The pace of loading had been fast, too fast, and the training of the men on that night shift had been minimal. The deeper anyone looked, the worse the picture became. Meanwhile, in the barracks, surviving sailors gathered in stunned clusters. Some cried. Some sat in silence. Others tried to piece together who was gone. They pointed to empty bunks. They recited names in whispers. They struggled with the guilt of being alive simply because their shift hadn't started yet. At 2 o'clock, the Navy issued the first internal casualty estimate. It was grim. The number 320 appeared. No one argued. The next step was clear. The base had to be cleared of debris, secured, and prepared for investigation. And the men who were still alive would soon be ordered back to work. In the days following the explosion, Port Chicago looked like a scar on the coastline. The shoreline was littered with fragments of metal still warm to the touch. Charred wood floated in the shallows. The smell of burnt fuel and explosives lingered in the air, carried by the delta wind. The base moved like a ghost town, quiet, unsettled, full of men walking slowly, as if the ground itself might collapse beneath them. For the survivors, the trauma was quieter but heavier. Many couldn't sleep. Others jolted awake at every loud noise. They knew the faces of the men who had disappeared. They had worked beside them hours before the blast. And now, the Navy wanted them to do it again. On July 24th, just 1 week after the disaster, officers gathered the surviving ammunition crews and delivered the decision. They would resume loading ordnance immediately, this time at a different pier. The announcement hit like a fresh shockwave. Some men stared in disbelief. Others whispered under their breath. A few protested outright, but quietly, carefully. Nothing about this felt right. It wasn't fear alone, it was logic. They still had no explanation for the explosion. They had no new training. No new safety measures. No answers. No assurance that the next crate they touched wouldn't trigger another white flash. One sailor later said, "They were asking us to walk back into the fire without telling us what caused it." The officers insisted the work was safe. They insisted the procedures were sound. They insisted nothing like the explosion could happen again. But the men had seen what sound procedures led to. The tension was visible. Hands tightened into fists. Voices wavered. Some men felt their legs shaking. These weren't soldiers refusing combat. These were sailors being asked to handle thousands of pounds of explosive cargo with the knowledge that one mistake, one vibration, one dropped crate, could wipe out another generation of their friends. And still the Navy pressed on. New officers arrived, many with limited experience. They tried to motivate the crews, sometimes with encouragement, sometimes with pressure. They spoke of duty, of the war effort, of sacrifice. But their words felt distant compared to the memory of the fireball that had erased the pier. What the Navy underestimated was something simple and deeply human. Survivors remember. They remember the sound of the blast. They remember the shockwave hitting their chest. They remember seeing nothing where their friends once stood. And they didn't want to repeat the same mistakes under the same conditions. By the end of the briefing, the officers issued a final instruction. All sailors were to report to the new loading site the next day. Some nodded, resigned. Some stayed silent. Some felt anger rise like heat. And a small group began whispering a question that would soon shake the entire Navy. What if we don't go? The morning after the briefing, the surviving ammunition crews gathered outside the barracks in uneasy silence. They stood in small clusters, speaking in low voices, looking around as if waiting for someone to explain what they already knew. The Navy expected them to return to loading bombs, exactly as before, with the exact same training, on a different pier that looked no safer than the one that had vanished in a fireball. No new procedures. No new safety guidelines. Not even an official explanation for the explosion. The men weren't rebelling. They weren't making a political stand. They were afraid. Rationally afraid. When the muster call sounded, 258 sailors reported for duty, but they didn't move toward the worksite. They gathered instead on the parade ground, standing shoulder to shoulder, waiting for an officer to give them something, anything that would make the job survivable. Instead, the officers told them again, return to loading ammunition. A quiet, heavy moment followed. Then, one by one, men began to shake their heads. Not dramatically, just a small movement, barely visible, but unmistakable. A few said it aloud. Others simply stepped back. The message was clear. We won't go back until we know what caused the explosion. It was not defiance. It was not sabotage. It was the most human reaction possible. But in the military structure of 1944, fear didn't matter. Only obedience did. Officers quickly labeled the refusal as insubordination. They warned the men that their careers, their pay, and even their freedom were at risk. But the sailors held their ground. They asked for safety training. They asked for clarity. They asked for leadership that acknowledged the reality they had just witnessed. One sailor said, "I'll die fighting the Japanese if I have to, but I'm not going to die because someone rushes me with a crate of bombs." The officers didn't have an answer. The standoff intensified. Voices rose. Orders were repeated. Threats grew harsher. But the men stayed where they were. Finally, the Navy escalated. Armed Marines arrived to restore discipline. Trucks rolled in. The atmosphere changed instantly. What had been a tense conversation became something much colder. The presence of rifles turned fear into anger. Some sailors stepped forward to negotiate. Others felt hope slipping away. The command gave a final order. Report to the pier. Now. Or face consequences. Still, 50 men refused. These 50 would soon be charged with mutiny, a word that carried weight far beyond the truth of the situation. But in that moment, they weren't thinking about charges, tribunals, or history. They were thinking about the friends they had lost, the white flash that erased an entire pier, and the terrifying possibility of being forced into the same conditions again. Before the day ended, the 50 were taken into custody. The Navy believed it had regained control. But in doing so, it set the stage for one of the most controversial trials in American military history. When the 50 sailors were taken into custody, most of them believed the situation would calm down. They assumed the Navy would eventually recognize the reality. They weren't refusing combat. They weren't disobeying out of rebellion. They were refusing to handle unexplained explosives only days after 320 men had been vaporized doing the same job. But that's not what happened. Within days, the Navy announced formal charges. The word landed with the weight of a falling anchor. Mutiny. In military law, mutiny means an organized attempt to overthrow authority, one of the most serious accusations possible. The sailors were stunned. Some thought it was a misunderstanding. Others felt their stomachs tighten. Mutiny wasn't a reprimand. It wasn't even a criminal charge. It was a label with historical gravity, the kind used for uprisings and violent refusals of command. But the Navy wasn't thinking about nuance. It was thinking about precedent. If these men refused orders because they feared another disaster, what would stop sailors in other ammunition depots from doing the same? The Pacific War depended on constant logistics. The Navy could not allow fear, justified or not, to slow the flow of bombs, shells, and depth charges across the ocean. So the trial had a purpose: to send a message. The courtroom was set at Mare Island. Rows of chairs were filled with officers, legal teams, and a few observers permitted to watch. The 50 sailors were lined up, each assigned a defense lawyer, most of whom were overwhelmed by the scale of the case. They faced the possibility of 15 years in prison. The prosecution's argument was simple and rigid. Orders were given. Orders were refused. Therefore, mutiny. The defense tried to inject reality. They argued that fear, not rebellion, drove the refusal. They pointed to the lack of training, the absence of safety protocols, the incomplete investigation, and the psychological trauma of watching friends evaporate in a blast that lit the night like a weapon test. They also asked the obvious question: how can you charge men with mutiny when they asked only for safer working conditions? The prosecutors countered with cold logic. The Navy does not negotiate with fear. Witnesses were called. Some officers admitted under oath that they themselves did not fully understand the explosive materials the men were loading. Others acknowledged they had never seen proper safety demonstrations. A few conceded that the pace at Port Chicago had been pushed to maintain wartime efficiency. But none of it shifted the momentum of the trial. The Navy needed the story to end in one way: discipline reaffirmed. As the proceedings continued, it became clear the verdict was not going to reflect the complexity of Port Chicago. The courtroom wasn't a place for truth, it was a mechanism for stabilizing the chain of command. After several weeks of testimony, the judge read the decision. All 50 men were found guilty. No leniency. No acknowledgement of the circumstances. No consideration for the dead, the wounded, or the unanswered technical questions. Guilty. The weight of the word hung in the air, a final blow delivered not with explosives, but with institutional certainty. In the weeks after the guilty verdict, the Navy expected the case to fade quietly into the background. Port Chicago, in the official narrative, was a tragic accident followed by an unfortunate but necessary reaffirmation of discipline. The war was still raging across the Pacific. Headlines were focused on Saipan, Guam, and the steady American push toward the Japanese homeland. But something unexpected happened. The story didn't disappear. It leaked. At first, it spread in fragments. Whispered accounts, offhand remarks from sailors rotated through other bases, and quiet questions asked by officers who knew that ammunition didn't simply explode without cause. Then journalists caught wind of the trial. Not the explosion, the trial. The word mutiny was too heavy, too dramatic, too historically loaded to ignore. Reporters began calling Washington. Letters were sent to newspapers. A few editors believed there was more to the story. And soon, a broader picture emerged. 50 sailors, all of whom had survived a catastrophic blast, had refused to resume the same hazardous work without explanation or training, and were punished as if they had attempted an uprising. Among the first to question the narrative was the NAACP, led by Thurgood Marshall. When he visited the trial, he didn't see mutineers. He saw men pushed into a lethal environment with insufficient training, then blamed for wanting clarity after witnessing one of the deadliest non-combat disasters in American naval history. Marshall began speaking publicly. He said the word mutiny was a distortion, a legal weapon used to silence fear. He asked how justice could be served when the cause of the explosion remained officially undetermined. His involvement changed everything. Suddenly, the case was no longer a quiet matter of military discipline. It became a public question about accountability, training, and the way the United States treated the very men who kept its war machine running. Editorials appeared in major papers. Columnists asked why the Navy hadn't implemented safety reforms before ordering crews back to work. One article described the trial as punishment in search of an explanation. Behind the scenes, some senior officers felt the pressure. They had known from the beginning that technical negligence played a role. They understood the loading procedures had been rushed. They realized the men had legitimate concerns. But going against the official verdict risked their careers, and risked the logistical engine of the Pacific campaign. The war needed bombs. Bombs needed loaders. Loaders needed discipline. That was the logic. Still, the narrative was slipping. Congress quietly requested updates. Civil rights organizations continued to press. Families of the convicted sailors asked for answers the Navy wasn't prepared to give. The story reached radio programs. And slowly, Port Chicago transformed from an accident into a national conversation. But the question remained. Would any of this pressure be enough to change the verdict? As public pressure mounted, the Navy found itself in a position it had never intended to be in, defending a verdict that looked increasingly fragile under scrutiny. What began as an internal disciplinary action had become a national debate. Newspapers questioned the logic. Civil rights groups challenged the fairness. Congress wanted briefings. And ordinary citizens, reading between the lines, began to ask the simplest question of all. Why were these men asked to go back? Inside Navy offices in Washington, the tone shifted from confident to cautious. Memos circulated quietly. Commanders were advised to choose their words carefully. Spokesmen were instructed to avoid specifics. The phrase, "no evidence of enemy action," was repeated so often that it started to sound like a shield, a way to avoid addressing the real issue, internal failure. Still, the Navy could not simply overturn the verdict. Doing so would undermine the chain of command at a moment when the Pacific campaign demanded absolute logistical discipline. Reversing the convictions would set a precedent that fear, even justified fear, could influence military operations. So the Navy chose a middle path. Admit nothing, adjust everything. New safety procedures were introduced quietly. Loading training became more structured. Supervising officers received updated briefings on ordnance handling. Equipment at ammunition depots was reviewed and, in some cases, replaced. But none of this was linked publicly to the Port Chicago disaster. No statement said, "We are improving safety because something went wrong." Instead, the language was vague, procedural, almost bureaucratic. At the same time, influencers like Thurgood Marshall continued to dismantle the Navy's version. He traveled, wrote, spoke, and insisted the men had been set up to fail. His argument was straightforward. If they were expected to follow orders, the Navy should have ensured those orders were safe. People listened. Some senior officers, behind closed doors, privately agreed. A few admitted that the speed at Port Chicago had been operationally reckless. Others conceded that the training was insufficient under wartime conditions. But officially, nothing changed. The trial record stood. The guilty verdict remained. Yet cracks were forming. Inside the Navy's legal branch, a small but persistent group began re-evaluating what had happened. Not because of public pressure, but because the technical inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. Investigators still had no definitive cause for the explosion. No single failure could explain the magnitude of the blast. The report hinted at the possibility of mishandled bombs, unstable fuses, dropped crates, or structural vibrations, but never committed to any one conclusion. It was a technical void. A silence where the truth should have been. And this void made the conviction of the 50 sailors harder to defend. As 1944 continued toward its bloody climax in the Pacific, the Port Chicago story refused to fade. It lingered at the edges of the national conscience. Not loud, but persistent. And then something unexpected happened. People inside the Navy began to wonder whether the verdict would survive the end of the war. As 1945 approached, the winds of the war were shifting. The United States was pushing deeper into the Pacific, island by island, tightening the noose around Japan. Production lines were running at full capacity. Bombers reached farther. The Navy, after years of brutal combat, could finally see the outline of victory on the horizon. And that changed everything. In wartime, the Navy could argue that discipline must come before everything else. But in peacetime, people asked questions. Inside offices in Washington, senior officers began to discuss Port Chicago with a tone they hadn't used months earlier. No one was ready to admit wrongdoing, but the fear was clear. The longer the convictions stood, the more explosive the topic would become after the war ended. Already, journalists were showing renewed interest. Editorials resurfaced. Public attention, once scattered by the chaos of global conflict, was slowly turning its focus back toward domestic issues: training, fairness, racial inequality, accountability. This shift put Port Chicago in a new, uncomfortable spotlight. Even within the Navy, the climate was changing. Younger officers, those who had joined late in the war and hadn't been part of the original decision, were more willing to question the logic behind the mutiny verdict. Some argued privately that the convictions had less to do with discipline and more to do with maintaining wartime momentum. A confidential memo circulated in the Bureau of Naval Personnel summed up the new internal mood. Once hostilities cease, the optics of this case may prove detrimental to the service. Optics, a word rarely used during combat, suddenly mattered. Meanwhile, civilian advocates kept pushing. Thurgood Marshall, now more visible than ever, warned that the Port Chicago convictions would not survive public examination. He emphasized that the trial had hinged on fear, not insurrection. He predicted that, after the war, the men would demand justice, and America would expect answers. Families of the convicted sailors wrote letters to Congress. Newspapers revisited the explosion. Some officers quietly distanced themselves from the original decisions. And, for the first time, members of Congress asked whether a full reevaluation was necessary. The Navy felt the pressure but tried to hold its ground. Its official stance did not change. Its reports remained vague. Its position remained firm. No evidence of enemy involvement. Procedures followed. Discipline required. Still, the tone softened. Behind closed doors, high-ranking officials asked uncomfortable questions. Do we know what really caused the explosion? Were the loading practices safe? Could the men reasonably fear for their lives? Those questions hadn't been asked in 1944. But in 1945, when victory felt close, they became impossible to avoid. As American troops advanced across the Pacific, the nation's attention slowly shifted from survival to accountability. And many suspected the truth. The Port Chicago story was far from over. When the war finally ended in 1945, America exhaled. Cities filled with celebrations, factories slowed, and the nation began the long process of returning to something like normal life. But for certain corners of the Navy, there was a quiet sense of unease. Victory had brought gratitude, but also clarity. And with clarity came scrutiny. Port Chicago, which had been overshadowed by the massive operations of the Pacific, returned like an echo no one could ignore. The families of the 50 convicted sailors wrote new letters, not in fear, but with renewed confidence. They asked Congress why their sons were still carrying the label mutineer. They asked why the Navy hadn't released a complete explanation for the explosion. They asked what had been done to prevent another tragedy. In a country no longer consumed by war, those questions found traction. Reporters revisited the story with fresh eyes. Editorials compared the disaster to industrial accidents on the home front and questioned why the Navy had been allowed to investigate itself. Some columnists noted that every major logistical accident of the war had led to reforms, except this one. And behind the scenes, the Navy knew the scrutiny was justified. The investigation conducted in 1944 had never identified a single, definitive trigger. No mechanical failure. No chemical anomaly. No enemy sabotage. Just an explosion of unknown origin. A phrase that, in peacetime, sounded increasingly weak. Internal records from the Judge Advocate General's office revealed concern that the mutiny convictions might be overturned under civilian review. One officer wrote bluntly, "Fear, after such an event, is not unreasonable." This sentence circulated quietly among officers, a sign of shifting attitudes. Meanwhile, Thurgood Marshall sensed the moment. He resumed his campaign, reminding America that the 50 had been punished not for disobedience, but for refusing to risk their lives under unsafe conditions. He pushed for a full review of the trial, using the moral authority of a country that had just fought for freedom abroad. Public pressure increased. Legal pressure mounted. Even military pressure grew from within. Some officers who had served in ammunition depots during the war admitted that Port Chicago had lacked proper oversight. They acknowledged that, even after reforms, loading conditions remained hazardous in many ports. Their testimonies, informal but increasingly common, added weight to the argument that the 50 men had acted out of rational self-preservation. The Navy couldn't simply ignore what was happening. It began, quietly, to reduce the sentences of the convicted sailors. Not because the verdict was wrong, officially, it still stood, but because the political climate demanded a softening. Some of the men were released early. Others were reassigned. But the Navy did not erase the convictions. Not yet. Still, something fundamental had changed. America was ready to talk about Port Chicago without the filter of wartime urgency. And that opened the door to deeper questions. Questions about responsibility, engineering standards, ordnance stability, and the culture of speed that had dominated wartime logistics. Once the war ended, technical experts who had spent years dealing with ordnance across the Pacific finally had time, and freedom, to look at Port Chicago again. For the first time since 1944, the explosion wasn't treated as an embarrassment or a disciplinary issue. It was treated as a problem of engineering, materials science, and logistics under extreme pressure. And when these specialists revisited the evidence, a clearer picture began to emerge. The first point was obvious. The amount of explosive material loaded onto the E.A. Bryan was enormous. More than 4,600 tons, including aerial bombs, depth charges, artillery shells, and powder. The ship was essentially a floating warehouse of high-energy compounds stacked in ways that would never be acceptable under peacetime standards. Then came the second point. The loading procedures were inconsistent, rushed, and in some cases, technically unsafe. Witness statements revealed that crates were dropped frequently, sometimes from significant heights. Forklifts were seen slamming loads into position. Vibrations from locomotives and cranes traveled through the pier and directly into the hulls of the ships. Even the weathered wood of the pier played a role, amplifying structural tremors. Experts studying the materials noted that many of the bombs loaded that night contained Torpex, a powerful, sensitive explosive mixture designed for underwater shock performance. Torpex was stable under ideal conditions, but susceptible to ignition under sudden impact or significant friction. A dropped Torpex-filled depth charge could absolutely initiate a chain reaction. Another theory centered on fuses. Many of the shells and bombs loaded onto the Bryan were shipped with their fuses removed but packaged nearby. If a fuse was accidentally mixed with armed ordnance, the result could be catastrophic. Investigators in 1944 reported evidence of poor segregation of components, the kind of mistake that would be unthinkable under modern standards. Then there was the matter of static electricity. The combination of dry air, canvas, and metal-on-metal contact could create sparks strong enough to ignite exposed powder or unstable fuses. Under controlled conditions, risks were minimal. Under rushed wartime conditions, with inexperienced crews, the risks multiplied. Experts also noticed something unusual in the blast pattern. Some fragments of ship hull were curled inward, others outward. This suggested multiple detonations within milliseconds, not a single uniform event. That detail supported a chain reaction scenario. A dropped bomb or depth charge ignition, sympathetic detonation, full cargo detonation. The single most likely point of initiation, according to post-war analysts, was the forward hold of the E.A. Bryan, the same place witnesses saw a strange white flash minutes before the blast. And then there was the speed. Safety manuals warned that ammunition loading should never be rushed. But at Port Chicago, speed wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded. Records showed that officers pushed crews to beat loading records, a practice that introduced unnecessary risk and eliminated the margin of safety that should exist when handling tons of explosives. After months of study, the conclusion among technical experts became hard to ignore. Port Chicago was not a mystery explosion. It was a highly predictable failure in a system stretched beyond safe limits. No enemy action. No sabotage. No freak accident. Just physics, pressure, and a chain of small mistakes waiting for the worst possible moment. By the late 1940s, America was changing. The war was over. Veterans were home. The country was rebuilding itself, and with that rebuilding came a new willingness to question the decisions made in the name of wartime urgency. Port Chicago, once buried under the weight of global conflict, slowly resurfaced in political conversations. The first cracks appeared when civilian lawyers reviewed the court-martial transcripts. They noticed inconsistencies, not in the sailors' testimonies, but in the prosecution's assumptions. The case had hinged on the idea that the men acted collectively and intentionally to defy authority. But the transcripts showed fear, confusion, and a lack of safety safeguards, not rebellion. What had been treated as mutiny in 1944 looked, in hindsight, like a workplace safety protest, the sort you might see in a factory, not a battlefield. Meanwhile, Thurgood Marshall kept pushing. He wrote letters, organized meetings, and publicly criticized the Navy's handling of the trial. His argument was simple. You cannot call it mutiny when the danger was real. And people listened because the danger was real. 320 dead was proof enough. Inside the Navy, some officers privately supported a review. They admitted the logistics system had evolved since Port Chicago. Procedures were stricter. Training was better. Accident rates had dropped. In their view, acknowledging past mistakes would not harm the service, it would show growth. But others resisted fiercely. They feared that overturning the verdict would imply negligence. They feared it would open the door to lawsuits. They feared it would tarnish the Navy's wartime legacy. So reform moved slowly. Very slowly. In 1946, the Navy released many of the convicted sailors on parole. Not because it believed they were innocent, but because the political cost of keeping them imprisoned had grown too high. Their sentences were reduced, their records partially cleaned, but the mutiny convictions stayed. For the men, it was a bittersweet freedom. They walked out of confinement, but carried a label they never deserved. As the 1950s began, the story lingered, unresolved. Journalists wrote anniversary articles. Civil rights groups continued to apply pressure. Some veterans spoke publicly, admitting that they, too, would have refused to return to the pier under the same conditions. Gradually, the narrative shifted. People stopped asking, "Why did they refuse?" and started asking, "Why were they ever forced to go back?" That shift marked the beginning of a broader reassessment, not just of the trial, but of the explosion itself, the loading practices, and the entire wartime mindset that had produced the disaster. But official action remained slow. Correcting a wartime error required more than legal review. It required political will, something that, at the time, was in short supply. Yet the pressure continued to build. As the years passed, the Port Chicago disaster faded from the headlines, but it never truly disappeared. It resurfaced quietly, then loudly, then quietly again, like a fault line shifting beneath the surface of American memory. For some, it remained a wartime tragedy. For others, it became something deeper, a question the country had avoided answering. By the 1960s, that question was harder to ignore. The civil rights movement was reshaping the national landscape. Old assumptions were being challenged. Institutions were being asked to justify past decisions. In this new climate, Port Chicago returned, not as a logistical failure, but as an example of how wartime urgency had collided with human rights. Historians began writing about it. Journalists revisited the trial transcripts. Former sailors, now older and more confident, spoke publicly about the fear they felt in 1944 and the pressure that followed. One article in the early 1970s called Port Chicago, the military's forgotten moral wound. It described how the Navy had punished fear instead of addressing the cause of the explosion, and how the trial had become a tool of convenience rather than a pursuit of truth. Slowly, the language surrounding the event changed. Mutiny became the Port Chicago 50. Accident became preventable disaster. Discipline became injustice. Lawyers and historians argued that the trial had been shaped not by legal standards, but by wartime necessity. They also highlighted something the original investigators had never fully admitted: the men had legitimate reasons to fear for their lives. By the late 1980s, pressure grew again. Congress received petitions calling for full pardons. Academic studies explained how wartime loading practices ignored basic safety principles. Documentaries explored the technical errors, the rushed tempo, and the absence of training that made Port Chicago a disaster waiting to happen. The Navy, however, remained cautious. It acknowledged that the sailors had faced dangerous conditions. It acknowledged that the trial occurred under unique wartime pressures. But it still hesitated to overturn the convictions. Why? Because doing so meant confronting an uncomfortable truth. The Navy itself had contributed to the explosion, through rushed procedures, inadequate training, and expectations that ignored physical limits. Then came the 1990s. A new generation of lawmakers, historians, and activists renewed the push. They argued that the Port Chicago 50 deserved not only recognition, but justice. Reports were drafted. Hearings were held. Survivors, now elderly, testified with quiet dignity about the night the sky lit up and the days that followed. Their voices carried weight. In 1994, exactly 50 years after the disaster, the U.S. government took its first major step. It officially recognized Port Chicago as a historical tragedy and established the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial. It wasn't justice yet, but it was acknowledgement. A place where the truth could be told. Where visitors could stand near the water and feel the weight of what had happened. Where the story could no longer be buried under wartime necessity. But justice, real justice, still required one final step. By the time the 21st century began, the story of Port Chicago no longer lived in the margins of history books. It had become a case study in wartime pressure, systemic failure, and the cost of ignoring fear. More importantly, it had become a human story, one that demanded closure. And slowly, closure came. In 1999, President Bill Clinton issued a full pardon to one of the Port Chicago 50, Freddie Meeks, who had long advocated for the exoneration of all involved. It was a symbolic gesture, deeply meaningful, but not yet enough. The other 49 men still carried their convictions. The system had acknowledged injustice, but only in part. Over the next decade, historians, veterans groups, lawmakers, and civil rights advocates continued pressing. Reports were drafted, redrafted, and debated. New evidence emerged from wartime records. Old testimonies were re-evaluated with modern standards. Technical experts reinforced what post-war investigators had suspected: the explosion was not mysterious, not unforeseeable, and certainly not the fault of the men who loaded the ammunition. It was a system overloaded past its breaking point. In 2014, 70 years after the disaster, Congress formally asked the Navy to re-examine the trial and consider clearing the records of all 50 sailors. The request did not come from emotion alone. It came from facts. Unsafe procedures, inadequate training, and a rushed wartime tempo that placed lives at risk. The Navy responded cautiously, acknowledging that the men had legitimate reasons to fear returning to work. It conceded that conditions at Port Chicago did not meet modern safety standards. And it admitted that the men were operating under extraordinary stress. But the final step, fully overturning the mutiny convictions, remains complex and politically sensitive. To this day, legal and historical efforts continue. Advocates argue that the 50 acted out of rational self-preservation, not rebellion. They argue that the label mutiny has no place in this story. And in the eyes of most historians, that argument has already won. Today, when visitors stand at the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial, the silence feels heavy. The water is calm. The air is still. The shoreline is quiet. And yet, the memory of that flash, that white sphere of impossible light, lingers in the atmosphere. The memorial lists the names of the 320 men who died. It honors the survivors who carried the trauma for decades. And it stands as a reminder of the cost of speed, of pressure, of overlooked warnings. Port Chicago is no longer just an accident. It is a lesson, one written in steel fragments and human voices that refused to vanish. A lesson about accountability. A lesson about fear. A lesson about the invisible risks inside every wartime machine. And a lesson about the courage it takes not just to face danger, but to say, "We will not walk back into that fire." The story ends where it began, on the shore of Northern California, under a quiet sky. But now, the silence tells a different truth. What happened at Port Chicago was not rebellion. It was survival. And it took the United States most of a century to finally say those words out loud.